Man, it looks really nice outside today. I have been going a little crazy in here. It might be nice to go outside. Okay, maybe not. Quarantine. Ain't it fantastic? I can't tell if my family has always been this aggravating or if I've just lost my mind. Probably both. After the chaos of online school started settling into a bit more of a routine, I felt kind of anxious about not really doing much over quarantine. Me, being a history buff that is very critical of the government, thought it'd be interesting to compare a past pandemic to COVID. By analyzing similarities and differences, we can see what works, what didn't work, what definitely didn't work, and plan better for next time. I'll talk about the origins of the virus, how they spread, a bit about the viruses themselves, how different countries around the world reacted to them, then I'll do an overview of all the information, and then talk about what we should be doing in the future. As Philip DeFranco would say, let's just jump right into it. The origins of the Spanish flu are not very clear. Even with all the advancements made in science and technology today, researchers aren't able to find a geographical origin of the virus. Since it started during World War I, it's widely believed that either a European or North American country is to blame. Another culprit could be Asia, as throughout history, most viruses originate there and then spread to the rest of the world. That last bit of information that I just said about Asia, I got that from a CDC article written in 2006. Jeffrey, David, you poor souls, you had no idea what was to come. So yeah, in terms of origins, everyone blames everyone else. The best way I can explain it is...
I didn't do it! Okay. Everybody just calm down.
Count of three, we're all gonna put down our guns.
I have crossbows.
We'll put down our weaponry on the count of three.
Okay.
You ready?
I'm ready.
1, 2, 3.
Yeah!
I'm going to settle this once and for all. I always knew they were up to something. Anyway, we don't have a geographical location, but we do have an animal origin. Ducks. Ducks were the original carriers and were immune to the symptoms of the virus. As time went on, they transmitted it to mammals. As it started spreading between mammals, it mutated and eventually made its way to humans. COVID's origins are very different. For one, we have an exact geographical origin.
China!
Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with the initial theory of COVID's origin. People ate bats in a street food market and got the virus from them. Even early on, conspiracy theorists, such as myself, realized that there were some major inconsistencies with the Chinese government's story. Firstly, the Chinese government didn't place blame on, maybe a place that actually sells bats like a street food market. Instead, they placed the blame on a seafood market that didn't even sell bats. Secondly, the virus's origin city of Wuhan is home to a massive biolab research center. Do you happen to know what that biolab was researching before, during, and after the outbreak? They were researching the effects of SARS in bats. For those who don't know, COVID is a strain of the virus SARS. Thirdly, despite fiercely trying to keep up the narrative that biolabs were not responsible for the virus, China placed new restrictions on research centers just a few weeks after the outbreak. Despite all of this very real evidence, you will not hear a single news anchor refer to this as anything more than a baseless conspiracy. In the future, I'd like to do a video on all of the Chinese government's lies over the course of this pandemic. Trust me, there are so many, but I'm gonna wait till the dust settles a bit more. Plus, the autonomous zone is too hilarious not to make a video about, so expect to see 1 or 2 on those soon. So in summary, the Chinese government made COVID in a lab, accidentally leaked it to the public, is desperately trying to cover it up, and don't let the media tell you any different. Spanish flu could not have picked a better time to begin. The virus started in 1918, right around the time during World War I where the United States was sending troops in full force to Europe. As I mentioned in the previous section, we don't know whether or not the American soldiers brought it over to Europe or if it was started in Europe and the American soldiers caught it, but either way it spread like crazy. In Europe, troops would be cramped together in ships or rail cars for days at a time, which led the virus spread very easily. As the virus was transmitted from soldier to soldier, it made its way to a military base in Kansas called Fort Riley. One of the cooks working in the kitchens had gone to the infirmary complaining of a headache and sore throat. At first, the doctors thought that it was just a typical flu, but as he stayed in the infirmary, his symptoms worsened and became much more irregular. Based on the irregular symptoms, doctors realized they were dealing with a whole new strain of the influenza virus. By the time they realized this, it was too late because the virus had already spread across the fort. By the day's end, there were over 100 men in the infirmary all showing symptoms of the new virus. The virus continued to spread across the battlefield due to the large amount of troops stationed there and the cramped conditions of the trenches. One of the main problems with the virus was how rapidly it could spread. Only 12 hours after the first diagnosed case at Fort Riley, the virus had already made its way to Queens, New York. In Europe and North America, the virus spread throughout citizen populations. Hospitals quickly became overwhelmed as many doctors and nurses have been sent over to Europe to help with the war effort. The east coast of the United States was hit very hard by the virus. In New York, thousands were being hospitalized with a dozen people dying every single day. Despite that very startling fact, New York City's health commissioner made a statement saying that there was nothing to worry about. His statement is a bit more understandable once you remember that this was happening during World War I. A victory in trench warfare is based on who can outlast the other. Germany was beginning to run low on resources, so the United States announcing that they may be swept up into a deadly pandemic would have given them enough morale to keep pushing through. Little did the United States know, Germany was also trying to cover up the virus. Neither side wanted to admit that they were suffering because it would have been admitting defeat. Spain was neutral during the war, so they freely reported how much they were suffering from it. Because of that, Spain was looked at as the hub and origin of the pandemic. That's where we get the name Spanish flu from. Preventative measures weren't really an option with the Spanish flu. The virus wasn't even recognized until it was way too late. And even if they had caught the virus earlier on, I highly doubt that scared for their lives, cramped together troops in trenches would really care that much about social distancing. COVID, on the other hand, could have easily been prevented from turning into a worldwide pandemic. This pandemic could have been completely avoided if China had just been honest from the beginning. The Chinese government had almost immediately recognized that COVID had been leaked to the public, but insisted that everything was fine. When things began spiraling out of control, the Chinese government tried to cover up their mistake and rejected help from other countries. They wanted to appear powerful in front of other countries and caused a pandemic in the process. In addition to all of that, the Chinese government was also incredibly hypocritical. They shut down domestic travel across China in order to limit the spread of the virus, yet when other countries tried to place travel bans, the Chinese government claimed it was unwarranted. They were perfectly fine with other countries getting infected with a virus that they knew to be deadly. In fact, they probably encouraged it, because if everyone gets dragged down with the virus, it doesn't make them look weaker in comparison. The spread of COVID was also helped greatly by the media. Because Trump called out the Chinese government for handling the pandemic poorly, the mainstream media decided to push the narrative that China was doing everything in their power to stop it and that travel bans were completely unnecessary and racist. Looking back at news coverage from January to March is honestly infuriating. Despite what the media would like you to believe, travel bans are extremely helpful preventative measures. In a recent study done by the Journal of Travel Medicine, they used a travel ban put in place by Australia to see if it was effective. The travel ban was placed on February 1st, before the virus had spread far from China. They modeled 3 different outcomes. One of them was if no ban had been placed. Scenarios 2 and 3 were if the current ban was followed by a complete or partial lifting on March 8th. The full ban scenario predicted 57 cases on March 6th, while in the real world there were 66. That's pretty close, less than 10 off. They predicted that with no travel ban there would be over 2,000 cases and 400 deaths. The travel ban reduced cases by 86%. By cutting themselves off from China, they greatly reduced the spread of the virus in Australia. A perfect example of what the United States could have looked like without travel bans is Italy. The Italian government deemed the travel bans racist and completely rejected them. With no travel bans to stop it, 3 flights from Wuhan were coming in every week. Yes, you heard that right. 3 times a week, a plane full of people would come in from a center of a pandemic. So what did Italy's president decide to do instead of a travel ban? Well, he encouraged his citizens to hug a Chinese person to combat racism. Yeah, that's not an Onion or Babylon Bee headline. The leader of Italy told his citizens to hug the planefuls of people from the center of the epidemic. Genius move, Italy. So those are the 2 main ways COVID spread: secrecy and downplaying the severity. The Spanish flu actually had its own cover-up fiasco in Australia. Victoria had an outbreak of the virus, but attempted to cover it up. Because the rest of Australia was unaware that the virus had already reached them, they didn't put any preventative measures in place. This let the virus spread across the entirety of the continent. After it was revealed that Victoria had lied, none of the other states trusted each other. This caused total chaos, with each state employing different measures and misinformation soaring. Remind you of anything? So I've talked about how the viruses were created and spread, but I haven't really talked about the characteristics of the viruses themselves. Spanish flu started in the spring of 1918 and ended 12 months later in 1919. The more mild symptoms of the virus are similar to a typical flu: fever, sore throat, aches. The longer you had the virus, the more extreme the symptoms got. It was common for those infected to cough up bloody foam, have their skin take on a bluish tint, and to break out in purple blisters. The virus had a low incubation period of 1 to 3 days and acted quickly. This meant that a patient could go from seemingly perfectly healthy in the morning to on the verge of death by evening. Spanish flu spread in a very similar way to COVID. People would cough and send the virus into the air, which would then get breathed by someone else and cause them to get infected. Here's an interesting tidbit that you can repeat at parties to make up for your lack of social skills. The Spanish flu is called the mother of all influenzas because all strains of influenza A come from this virus, and that includes the swine flu. The most important thing to know about the Spanish flu is the waves it came in. The virus had 3 waves over the course of 12 months. The first wave was the smallest and had a high infection rate with about a death rate typical for the regular flu. The second wave was the largest and had a huge death rate. The third was closer to the first in terms of deaths, but was still pretty sizable. While the irregular symptoms were pretty odd, the thing that really set it aside from previous influenzas was the W-shaped curve. Most viruses had a U-shaped curve with death rates. They killed the very young and very old. But the Spanish flu is different. It killed the very old and very young, but also people aged 20 to 40. COVID doesn't seem to have this W-shaped curve, as it seems to only kill the very old and young adults with other diseases or a history of smoking, but there have been recent developments in New York with children dying of PIMS, an inflammatory reaction that some children get after getting over COVID. As you may have already noticed, COVID shares some symptoms with the Spanish flu, like fever, aches, and sore throat, but it also has other symptoms that include shortness of breath, loss of smell or taste, and coughing. Since COVID is a respiratory illness, it mostly targets your lungs, but in some severe cases, there can be strokes, seizures, heart attacks, blood clots, kidney damage, or diarrhea. And to close this video off, here's a paranoid thought by Morgan. The virus was leaked about 6 months ago, but it didn't really start to become a pandemic until 4 months ago. Let's assume this lasts for the same time as the Spanish flu, God I hope not, 12 months. We'd be a third of the way through it. So far we've had high infection rates and a pretty low death count. Sound familiar? To me it sounds a lot like the first wave of the Spanish flu. And if you count that 6-month thing I mentioned earlier, we'd be at just about the right time for a second wave. We're probably not going to get hit with a second wave where death counts would soar and target many ages, but I've been up at night thinking about it, and now you do too. In all seriousness, it looks like we may have another wave as cases are increasing again. However, deaths are not increasing along with it. This is typically how viruses work. The more deadly versions of the virus kill their host faster than other versions. Because of this, more deadly versions will infect less hosts. As this continues, the virus will get weaker and weaker. Of course, the virus can still mutate and get much deadlier, but COVID doesn't seem to be doing this. Near the end of this video, I'll talk about how I think we should be handling this second wave. By September, the Spanish flu had reached San Francisco. By October, Boston and Philadelphia were reporting 300 deaths every day. Every city and town was affected, and the places that had previously been in the "this is going nowhere" camp were now enforcing strict lockdowns. School, church, stores, and other public places were closed. Some cities made it illegal not to wear a mask outside. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? As far as I'm concerned, we have it worse. Sure, 1900s child, your dad is fighting in Europe and you've been traumatized by seeing dead bodies in the streets, but I had to go to school online. You will never understand the pain I went through on Zoom. As you may have noticed already, Spanish flu and COVID had very similar quarantines. Another similarity is that they didn't work. The strategy can essentially be boiled down to, we're going to shut down absolutely everything in hopes that the virus might stop transmitting. Spanish flu never died out because of quarantine. Instead, something very interesting happened. The virus started to go into cycles. This was seen a bit before with the waves. The virus would disappear for a while, come back and kill people, disappear again, and then come back weaker. As this went on, the flu death rate got lower and lower each wave. A few years later, it settled into the flu season routine that we have now. It went away on its own. And after the shutdown, the United States was hit with the post-World War I recession, which was pretty small, but then in 1920 it was hit with a much stronger depression that was unique to the United States region. Shutting down the economy for half a year will have economic repercussions. Let's take a look at our quarantine. Everything has been shut down, much like the Spanish flu, and gatherings are banned, which is against the First Amendment, but whatever, apparently you don't need to know that to become governor. Whitmer. You could possibly make the argument that sacrifices like this are necessary to stop COVID, even though there's no pandemic clause in the Constitution, but you'd be wrong, because this isn't even keeping us safe. The message of "stay home, save lives," and "flatten the curve" are not true. While the entire world has been on strict quarantine, the number of cases has only gone up. Deaths have only gone up. The number of new cases is still just going up. The economy has been severely impacted. The stock market already crashed during the beginning of the pandemic, and while it has recovered, the rest of the economy has not. Unemployment has gone to Great Depression levels, leaving many people unable to provide for their families. Small businesses are struggling to survive after being forced to shut down. Even large retailers haven't been able to keep up. So far, 6 major retailers have declared bankruptcy, with many of them either fully liquidating or closing the majority of their locations. Expect to see more as the year continues. So let's review. Both viruses are transmitted through the air. The mild symptoms of the virus are very similar. Attempted cover-ups made things worse, and somehow America is being blamed for both. There were also similar strategies to combat the virus. The country was shut down, and masks were encouraged, along with quarantine and social distancing. You know what really grinds my gears? People lumping social distancing and quarantine together. They aren't the same. Social distancing is just keeping some distance from people while life goes on as normal to be safe, and quarantine is isolating yourself if you have the virus. Anyway, the main difference was in how the virus functioned. Spanish flu was much more deadly, though you could argue we're not far enough into the 2020 pandemic to see if that's a similarity. It's interesting to theorize what could happen with our current pandemic. Will there be more waves? Will COVID also fall into a seasonal routine? How will the second wave be handled? There's a lot to learn from Spanish flu and COVID, which leads me into my next point.
Hello, boys! I'm back!
So I think based on the points I made in this video, we've done some things right with COVID and some things very wrong. The good thing is that we can take things we've learned from this pandemic and previous ones so that we can handle the next one better. It's inevitable that another major pandemic will happen. With how much travel and transportation is improving, the chances only go up. While some changes can be made to try to give us more time before the next one, more focus should go to strategies for the future. It wasn't an option with Spanish flu, but we can see that with COVID, travel bans greatly help slow the spread of the virus. If the origin of the virus is known, travel to that location should be greatly restricted or completely banned. In 2020, the United States had more time to prepare because we had cut ourselves off from infected areas. Europe still allowed travel between EU countries, even when it was clear the virus was serious. The most important takeaway is that quarantines and shutdowns don't work. Spanish flu didn't go away because of quarantine, it just fell into a weaker seasonal routine by itself. You could say that Spanish flu isn't a good example because COVID is a different type of virus. However, if you look at the latest SARS epidemic, you see that the virus also went away on its own. SARS came, killed a lot of people, and then died on its own. I'm not saying that pandemics shouldn't be taken seriously. Preventative measures like hygiene and social distancing, if used correctly, along with general cleanliness, can definitely help reduce transmissions and should not be ignored. Vaccines and treatments should be researched, but we have to remember that it's not a quick fix. It's not something that can be rushed out.
We need a cure! We need a cure!
So what should we do right now? A second wave seems to be on its way. I think our strategy with this second wave should be similar to what Sweden did at the beginning of the pandemic. If you're at risk or are frequently around at-risk people, then you stay home. Everyone else goes about business as usual, with the preventative measures I previously mentioned. This allows the economy to stay in relatively good shape during the pandemic. If a not-at-risk person gets COVID, they'll get over it just fine. As this happens, more and more of the not-at-risk population becomes immune. As this herd immunity continues, less and less people will be able to get infected. Eventually, the pandemic will almost completely cease, and at-risk people will be able to live safely. Maybe that seems a bit extreme, but I think it's a lot better than the mess of a plan we have now. The majority of our governors are repeatedly using a plan they know isn't working. They're doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results. That is the literal definition of insanity. New York has a very strict quarantine, yet 66% of new cases have been from people staying home. Either a ton of people with room temperature IQs got elected, or they're being intentionally malicious. I'm sorry, but I have a hard time believing that Cuomo is trying to help. If he genuinely believes that putting sick people into nursing homes is a good idea, then I give up on society. Putting people that are infected with a virus that primarily kills the elderly in a place filled with the elderly sounds like something out of Idiocracy. Governors are turning COVID into something insanely political when it shouldn't be. Most governors supporting the failing lockdown strategy are Democrats. Since it's an election year, they want to make people as unhappy as possible. Then, as you can see in ads and speeches, shift the blame onto Trump so that he's less likely to be re-elected. Many of them are probably trying to get their names out for a vice president nomination. Let's be honest. Did anyone outside of Michigan know who Whitmer was before COVID? I think it's pretty clear that most governors are on a severe power trip right now, so don't be shocked when they abuse this in the future. In fact, I'm calling it now. Next flu season, we'll go back into some form of quarantine because it's too hard to tell the difference between influenza and COVID. You can't be too shocked. We've been letting them get away with unconstitutional laws this entire pandemic. There is no pandemic clause in the Constitution. They aren't allowed to dictate what private businesses can do. They aren't allowed to shut down church. They aren't allowed to ban gatherings. The First Amendment gives us the right to gather and peacefully protest at any time, even if those in power don't like our opinions. Some people make the argument that freedom should be sacrificed for safety, which is an objectively bad opinion, but that argument can be completely disregarded with the recent Black Lives Matter protests. The fact that the peaceful anti-quarantine protests were called a danger to public safety, while the extremely violent and nowhere near socially distanced Black Lives Matter protests are praised, shows how painfully political this pandemic is. The ramifications of this shutdown will follow us for potentially years to come, but it doesn't have to be this way next time. Viruses have been around longer than we have and will always be around. There will be another bad virus, another pandemic, one that's probably as bad or worse than this one. We can't shut down every time a bad virus shows up. The results would be catastrophic. All we can do is learn the most effective way to limit its impact. Countries need to be more transparent, recognize the severity of the virus, and encourage common sense practices like social distancing and good hygiene. Leaders also need to focus on uniting rather than selfish politics.